Hello there, and welcome to Chapter 4. And in this chapter, in Crisis Communication, our focus is to apply some of the lessons we've learned about crisis overall into particular case studies. And what we're going to do is be looking at 6 case studies along with a little bit of additional information to sort of understand how we would take sort of the theory and knowledge we have about crisis communication and apply it to specific situations. You're going to be asked to do very similar things in your paper assignment. And our goal here is not to try and explain or understand every single element of a particular crisis, but rather to pick and choose. Find those things that occur during this crisis that you think are most valuable or interesting or significant, things that deserve explanation and evaluation, and providing your response to that. And so this chapter is a good kind of practice for you to think about doing a paper assignment on a particular crisis, choosing an angle for that crisis, and then writing about it. Basically, what we're engaged in is using what we call the case study approach. What lessons do particular case studies teach us? It's impossible to find the perfect example that teaches us everything we need to know about crisis communication. And in some cases, things are done better and others worse. And so what we want to do is pick from each case study a particular lesson or two that will help us in future situations. I've also put some additional articles and video clips into the presentation and on the website, and I'm hoping those additional resources will be useful. Please read and view those as well as this video and reading the textbook for this chapter. Much of the focus in this chapter helps to reflect a concept common to most of the text, what your authors call a discourse of renewal, and the idea that organizations and communities can recover from a crisis, and that renewal is an important crisis response format. And so our focus on Malden Mills, the additional reading there, and also the videos on the Greensburg, Kansas tornadoes will show you how in real situations a renewal focused helped those communities to get by, to survive, and eventually even perhaps to thrive. So let's look at the various case studies. The first case study on the list is the BP oil spill. Many of you may remember that. It was one of the largest environmental disasters the United States has experienced in recent times. But there are tons of lessons from this crisis. And the hard part I think your authors have is picking out a particular element of each crisis to reveal. There are many other things about these individual crises we could talk about. In BP's case, for example, the failure of the CEO to do a good job, he was fired, and there were a lot of concerns about leadership in that company, and they weren't ready on social media for a crisis of this size and this scope. But let's kind of focus on some of the things that the textbook talks about. And then if you want to learn more about these crises, there always will be other sources and articles and reports about them. In the BP oil spill case, the chapter is focusing on a couple things that are important to know about. One is what we call the role of the Public Information Officer, the PIO. In a crisis, there are multiple voices. There are a lot of people talking. There are a lot of people vying for media attention. And there are a lot of kind of competing narratives that are happening during the crisis. And that's important for you to consider. A lot of people will have the job of representing their organization in a complicated crisis. So the BP oil spill, you've got, yes, the Coast Guard, you've got BP, you've got the drilling company that created the platform, you've got families of the victims, you've got state governments and environmental officials, and all these public information officers are trying to provide information, trying to get their story out to the press, and representing their clients. And so I think this chapter example of using BP helps you to think about just the sheer complexity that a major crisis can create, and the fact that you've got a lot of people out there trying to get their message for their client to the press, And the press is dealing with that. And there are a lot of demands on organizations as well as the press to get a story published and publicized appropriately. And that's one of the great lessons of the BP oil spill. BP, for example, produced more than 300 some videos that were featured on YouTube about the spill. They were all over the place. But every organization impacted by a crisis is going to have something to say. And that's probably the one thing I want you to get out of this one most, is the fact that there are a lot of voices, and you have to think about how each of them are accomplishing their tasks. And so in doing a paper on, let's see, the BP oil spill, you wouldn't have to do all the voices, but you'd probably want to choose the one or two you think are most relevant. The Malden Mills plant fire is one of the first case studies that your authors used to help develop this renewal rhetoric perspective. Aaron Fierstein was a private owner of a mill that had a fire, a significant fire. It was a family-owned business, a private business. He was well known in the community. He basically became a celebrity for doing what's called the right thing, for helping to protect his employees. He paid them. He helped rebuild the company. Eventually, he went bankrupt trying to support his company. He could have retired and just taken the money and run, but he tried to rebuild the company. Malden Mills still exists, I believe. They made a product called Polartec, which is in a lot of your clothing, especially winter clothing. Look them up sometime. Learn a little bit more about this company that he managed to save, but there are also the pros and cons about this. The academic exercise, the assignment reading that you have on Malden Mills will show you how an academic perspective can write about this particular crisis. I encourage you, when you read that essay, to see what else you can learn from it beyond what your textbook talks about. And I had a chance to meet Aaron Fierstein. He's an interesting guy, neat old man who really believed in protecting his community and his employees. And the lesson of the Malden Mills fire is that doing the right thing can be a wonderful thing. You can get a lot of publicity for it. And although in some respects it wasn't entirely a happy ending, he certainly made it possible for a company that otherwise would have disappeared to at least maintain itself and continue working forward. The Adawa apple juice crisis is a really good example of a company that focused intense efforts on their customers and protecting them and creating a safer product event in the end. But I think your authors make a very good point that in the short term, employees and investors lost money and jobs. In the short term, it was revealed that the assumptions made by the company about the safety of their products was wrong, and that they were forced to largely reconvene how they juice their products and preserve them and package them and sell them. So they were impressive as a company in terms of the speed of their solution, but they're also a good example of the fact that not all solutions are happy for everyone. But the Odawa apple juice case study is a good example of what can be done effectively to respond to a crisis. The pink slime case is one I mentioned earlier in an earlier video. I showed you a photo of pink slime, one of the earlier slides. Lean, finely textured beef was not a crisis in the sense that they did anything wrong. They didn't contaminate the product. No one died. No one got sick. There haven't been any safety considerations. But the pink slime controversy and the question of beef safety became one of perception, which is one of the lessons also in the next chapter we'll talk about a little bit more. People didn't like the product because they thought they were being misled. They didn't like the way it looked. They didn't like the way it was named. And so this was a crisis focused on an ingredient in a food ingredient that was in a lot of products. And the public was kind of pressured and started to believe it could be potentially unsafe. And so the media went after them, and a lot of people in this region were hurt. There were people who lost jobs in the Waterloo area and other parts of Iowa because beef production was cut back and the product was off the market for a while. It's back on the market. They sued ABC for their reporting. They won a settlement in that lawsuit. But this case study shows you a few things about, it tells you something about perception, because it wasn't a problem with the safety of the product. That's not why people went after it. But it was a visual story and a story of naming and descriptiveness that really scared people off. And so we can learn a few things about the pink slime capacity, and what your authors also talked in an earlier chapter about exemplification and the depiction of a crisis to a public. And this crisis was depicted in a way that was harmful to the company and harmful to the business climate. And so it's still taking a lot of time for this company to restore some of its reputation. The tornado hits in Greenburg, Kansas is an amazing story. And you have a chance to watch a couple video clips. It actually there was a TV series about the rebuilding efforts. A major tornado destroys a small Kansas community. They're trying to decide on whether they should rebuild. They rebuild and go green in the process. They try to use renewal in a way that is creative and unique and tries to rebuild elements of the town despite a future threat of a tornado or other wind issues. So it's a good example of renewal rhetoric, and I really watch and listen to people struggle with the idea of rebuilding, listen to them talking about the dreams and aspirations of renewing their community and growing. And I think this is a great case study because it shows the renewal idea in action and gives you the opportunity to see how that sounded and what it sounded like and what people said and how they succeeded. It's a great case study that way. The Domino's crisis situation, the hoax video, is a really good example. Again, some of these reports, these crises, are not things that the company did wrong. Domino's did not do something wrong. Some of their employees created a prank video that went viral that hurt them. Malden Mills had an accident in a fire plant. It wasn't something they did intentionally. They weren't unsafe, but they were still hurt by their crisis. The pink slime case was a question of perception. It had nothing to do with an unsafe food product. So companies that have a crisis are not simply groups that have done something wrong. It is everybody. In Domino's situation, we have this hoax video. A couple employees make a really gross video. It spreads through social media, but Domino's isn't even aware of it until someone lets them know. They aren't monitoring social media. Now most companies do. And so Domino's learned from that experience, and they went on social media and responded with their own statements. And the CEO of the company, videotaped his response to the crisis. And I think you can see and hear, in looking at his response, an example of how then CEOs now tend to use YouTube videos as part of their response strategy and message strategy. One of the things I've added to the Domino's example is some links to a more recent campaign on their part. I think Domino's learned from their social media experience with the YouTube hoax, and so they started a campaign later, a few years, their turnaround campaign, they called it. It was more of a marketing campaign than a crisis campaign, but focusing on the fact that their products were no longer very popular, that they had losing support, and they're going to turn around and make themselves a better company. Watch the video in this link, or I think you can find it also in the website. Again, it's not a crisis response, although they kind of frame it as a crisis for them. But it's a really good example of a company, again, talking about renewal and changing and growing as an organization, and as a result, providing a better product for their population. So this piece of the Domino's is not your textbook, but it's a good example for you to look at as an extension. So to kind of summarize some of what this chapter is about, these are case studies in some respects, in many respects, focusing on a discourse of renewal, but if anything, providing you with a good opportunity to take a large, complicated crisis and pulling out certain variables that you could have written about, that you can talk about, that are important components or theories that you've seen, and become familiar with them. Be prepared to share them with me, and to share them with audiences. And renewal becomes this wonderful opportunity for organizations to rebuild. And your authors have kind of focused on that as the end part of their text as well. So look at the readings, look at how they share the ideas, look at how the language of renewal becomes popularized. You're going to see a lot more of this in the future. The discussion questions you're being asked to talk about in this week is to read the Malden Mills essay, get a feeling for why this is a great strategy. And remember that renewal is sort of a post-crisis strategy. It's what you do not during the crisis. It's what you do after the immediacy of the crisis is over. Why does this approach work? You can also compare what you learned about Malden Mills to the Greensburg, Kansas experience. Do you see similarities, differences, improvements, contrasts? That's up to you as well. So, we're up through chapter 4. We've got case studies. Start thinking about the case study you want to do for your own paper. And we will continue, I believe, next in chapter 5, talking about people's perceptions of crisis and the uncertainty that they tend to create and how that uncertainty plays a role in people's interpretation. Thank you.